The first time I saw those German mechanics circling our captured jeep like wolves around prey, I felt something twist in my gut that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite pride. It was December 1944, and I was hiding in what remained of a Belgian farmhouse basement, watching through a crack in the foundation as 3 Wehrmacht soldiers examined the vehicle we'd abandoned during our retreat 2 days prior. My leg was shattered from shrapnel, my uniform was caked with frozen mud and blood, and I had exactly 4 rounds left in my M1 Garand. But what held my attention wasn't my dire situation. It was the look on those Germans' faces as they ran their hands over that Oliver Willys MB like it was some kind of miracle machine from another world. The tallest one, a sergeant by the look of his insignia, kept shaking his head. He'd pop the hood, peer inside, close it, then open it again as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The younger mechanic, barely looked old enough to shave, was underneath the chassis, and I could hear him calling up to the others in rapid German. I didn't speak the language fluently, but I caught enough words. Simple, brilliant, impossible. The third man, older, with graying temples, just stood there smoking a cigarette, staring at the jeep with an expression I recognized because I'd worn it myself 100 times in this war. It was the look of a professional who'd just realized he'd been working with inferior tools all along. I remember thinking, even through the fever haze from my infected wound, that this moment mattered somehow. Here we were, 2 sides trying to kill each other for reasons that seemed both crystal clear and completely insane, depending on which hour of which day you asked me. And these enemy soldiers were having what looked like a religious experience over a simple American motor vehicle. My throat was so dry, I could barely swallow. The December cold had seeped so deep into my bones that I'd stopped shivering hours ago, which I knew was a bad sign. But I couldn't look away from that scene. I needed to see what they'd do next. I needed to understand what they were seeing that made hardened German mechanics look like children on Christmas morning. The young one finally crawled out from under the jeep, and even from 30 yards away through a crack in frost-covered stone, I could see the wonder on his face. He was gesturing wildly, pointing at different parts of the vehicle, and the other 2 were nodding. The sergeant climbed into the driver's seat, and I tensed. If they got that engine started, if they drove away with it, I'd be stuck here with no way to get back to American lines. Not that I was in any shape to drive, but a man clings to hope in any form when he's alone behind enemy lines with a fever climbing toward delirium. The engine turned over on the first try. Of course it did. That was the thing about the Willys Jeep. It always started. Rain, snow, mud, sand, didn't matter. Turn the key, and that little 4-cylinder engine would roar to life like it had been waiting all day just for you. I'd seen Jeeps start after being submerged in rivers. I'd seen them start after being abandoned in snowdrifts for 2 days. I'd seen one start after taking machine gun fire through the engine block, though it didn't run long after that. But they always started when you needed them to. And watching that German sergeant experience that reliability for the first time, I felt a strange surge of patriotic pride mixed with the very real terror of my situation. How did I end up in this basement, alone, wounded, watching enemy soldiers admire American engineering? That's the question I've asked myself 10,000 times in the decades since. The answer, like most answers in war, is complicated and simple at the same time. We've been pushing hard through Belgium after the breakout from Normandy. Everyone said the war would be over by Christmas. Everyone said the Germans were finished. Everyone was wrong. On December 16th, the Wehrmacht launched their last great offensive through the Ardennes forest. And suddenly we weren't advancing anymore. We were running. Our company had been holding a position outside a village whose name I never learned. Just another collection of stone buildings and frozen fields that looked exactly like the last 50 villages we'd passed through. We'd been there 3 days when the attack came. Not the probing patrols we'd gotten used to. Not the half-hearted mortar fire from an enemy we'd been told was out of fuel and ammunition. This was a full armored assault with tanks. We didn't know the Germans still had, and artillery that turned the frozen earth into a hellscape of fire and flying metal. Within Han, our company was scattered. Within 2 hours, we were in full retreat. And somewhere in that chaos, as I was diving for cover from a Nebelwerfer barrage, a piece of hot metal the size of my thumb punched through my calf and shattered the bone. Private Rodriguez dragged me to the jeep. Good kid from El Paso who wrote letters to his mother every single day without fail. He got me into the passenger seat, and our driver, Sergeant McCall from Oregon, gunned the engine. We made it maybe 200 yards before a Panzerfaust round hit the ground 3 feet from our front left tire. The explosion flipped us sideways, and I remember the strange sensation of tumbling through air. Still buckled into the seat, watching the gray December sky rotate past my field of vision. I hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind from my lungs, and when I could finally breathe again, I was alone. No Rodriguez, no McCall, no other Americans anywhere in sight. Just me, the overturned Jeep smoking gently in the snow, and the sound of German voices getting closer. Adrenaline is an amazing thing. With a shattered leg and 2 cracked ribs, I only discovered later, I managed to crawl to that farmhouse basement. I managed to pull aside the debris blocking the entrance. I managed to wedge myself into a corner where I had a sight line to where I'd left the Jeep, and then I let myself pass out for what might have been minutes or hours. When I came to, it was quieter. The battle had moved on, as battles do. The Jeep was gone from where it had landed, which meant someone had righted it and presumably checked it for booby traps. Smart. We'd been leaving surprises and abandoned equipment all across France and Belgium. But the Germans had learned our tricks. They were professionals, after all, even if they were on the wrong side of history. And now, a full day or maybe 2 days later, I couldn't be sure anymore, they'd brought their mechanics to examine their prize. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, on a farm where we made do with equipment that was already old when my father bought it, used from his neighbor. I learned young that machinery was just metal and moving parts, nothing magical about it. You kept it clean, you kept it lubricated, you learned its quirks, and treated it with respect, and it would do the job. When I enlisted in 42 and went through basic training, they assigned me to a mechanized infantry unit, and that's when I first encountered the Willys MB. I'll be honest, my first impression was that it looked like a toy. Small, boxy, not much heavier than a golf cart. But then they put us through the paces, and I began to understand what American automotive engineering had achieved. The Jeep could go anywhere. Not everywhere, nothing can go everywhere, but anywhere that mattered in combat. Mud up to the axles. The Jeep slogged through snowdrifts that would stop a truck. The Jeep found a way. We'd drive them up mountain trails that would make a mule think twice. We'd ford streams that looked too deep, and the Jeep would emerge on the other side still running. And here's the thing that those German mechanics were discovering as I watched from my hiding place. The thing that made the Jeep truly revolutionary, it was simple. Open the hood of a German vehicle, a Kuba wagon, or even one of their trucks, and you'd see complexity, clever engineering, sure, but engineering that required specialized tools and specialized knowledge to maintain. The German military-industrial complex had built vehicles that were marvels of over-engineering. Beautiful machines that worked brilliantly when they worked and became useless hunks of metal the moment something broke in the field. The Jeep? A farm boy with basic tools could keep it running. That was the design philosophy. Don't make it complicated. Make it fixable. Make it so the kid from Iowa or California or Mississippi who's never seen anything more complex than a tractor can figure it out under fire. I watched the German sergeant rev the engine, testing it, and even from my hiding spot, I could hear the difference between our machines and theirs. The Jeep's engine had a particular sound, a steady mechanical rhythm that said everything was working as intended. I'd heard German engines before, of course. In combat, you learn to identify vehicles by sound. A Panzer tank has a distinctive rumble. Their trucks whined in a particular way, but there was always something in those sounds, a sense that the machinery was working hard, struggling against itself. The Jeep just hummed along like it could do this all day, which it could. The 3 mechanics were having an animated discussion now. The older one was pointing at the steering column, then at the transfer case, then at the suspension. I knew enough about vehicles to follow his gestures, if not his words. He was explaining to the younger ones how every system on this machine was interconnected with elegant simplicity. The 4-wheel drive system that could be engaged with a simple lever, the power takeoff that let the Jeep run other equipment, the fold-down windshield that lets you mount a machine gun, the bracket positions that let you configure the vehicle for cargo or communications or medical evacuation. The Germans had specialists for everything. We had one vehicle that could do it all. My fever was getting worse. I could feel it in the way my thoughts were starting to drift, in the way the cold stoned against my back felt almost warm now, which I knew was my body failing to regulate temperature properly. I needed medical attention. I needed food and water. I needed to get back to American lines before infection took my leg or my life. But I couldn't move, not with 3 German soldiers 20 yards away. So I watched and I waited and I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The young mechanic had found the toolbox, and he was going through it with the careful attention of someone who just discovered treasure. We carried basic tools in every Jeep. Nothing fancy, just the essentials for field repairs. Wrenches, screwdrivers, pliers, a few spare parts. But here's what made it special. Every tool fit multiple parts of the vehicle. The same wrench that adjusted the carburetor could tighten the wheel lugs. The same screwdriver that adjusted the distributor could secure the seats. Standardization wasn't just about making manufacturing easier, though it did that too. It was about making sure that in the chaos of combat, a mechanic didn't need to carry 50 specialized tools. A dozen would do. I thought about Rodriguez and McCall. Where were they? Had they made it back to American lines? Were they captured? Were they dead in a ditch somewhere between here and where we'd been hit? I'd known both men for months. We'd crossed the Channel together on D-Day +3, had fought through the hedgerows of Normandy together, had celebrated when we broke out into France together. Rodriguez told terrible jokes that somehow always made everyone laugh anyway. McCall could fix anything mechanical and had kept our company's vehicles running when official supply channels failed us. Good men, both of them, and I had no idea if they were still alive. The Germans were trying to start the Jeep now with it in four-wheel drive engaged, and I could see the surprise on their faces when it handled differently than they expected. The Jeep in four-wheel drive had remarkable traction, but different steering characteristics. You had to adjust how you drove it, especially on snow and ice. The sergeant was figuring it out, though. I watched him work through it, making small adjustments, learning the vehicle's behavior. He was good, competent, professional, under different circumstances. He and McCall probably could have talked to engines and transmissions for hours, but these weren't different circumstances. He was trying to figure out how to use my country's equipment against my country's soldiers. December in Belgium is a special kind of miserable. The cold isn't as extreme as what you'd find further north or east, but it's damp. A cold that seeps through every layer of clothing and settles into your bones. The farmhouse basement offered some shelter from the wind, but no warmth. I'd been shivering uncontrollably when I first crawled in here, but now I was beyond shivering. My body had given up on that defense against the cold. My leg throbbed with every heartbeat, and I knew without looking that the wound was infected. I could smell it, that distinctive odor of tissue going bad that every combat soldier learns to recognize in fear. I'd been in the army for 2 years by this point. I'd seen a lot of men die, more than I want to remember or could accurately count if I tried. I'd seen what bullets do to human bodies. I'd seen what artillery does. I'd seen what happens when a tank rolls over a foxhole with a soldier still in it. I'd seen burns and blast injuries and trauma that should have killed men instantly but somehow didn't, leaving them screaming for mothers and wives and God until the morphine or death finally silenced them. I knew what infected wounds led to if left untreated. I'd watched men lose limbs I'd watched men die from blood poisoning. And now I was watching my own leg turn purple and black, watching red streaks creep up toward my knee, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was probably going to die in this Belgian basement, alone, while 3 German mechanics admired American automotive engineering 20 yards away. But I couldn't stop watching them. Maybe it was the fever. Maybe it was the absurdity of the situation finally breaking through my exhaustion. Maybe it was just that after 2 years of war, after 2 years of killing and watching friends die and trying not to think too hard about what we were doing or why, this moment of pure technical appreciation felt like something almost innocent. These 3 Germans weren't political officers spouting ideology. They weren't SS men with their skulls and lightning bolts and barely concealed sadism. They were mechanics, men who understood metal and engines and the difference between good design and bad design, and they were being forced to confront the fact that their enemy had built something genuinely superior. The older mechanic lit another cigarette and said something that made the other 2 laugh. It was a strange sound, that laughter human and ordinary and completely at odds with everything around us. These men had probably been fighting since Poland or France or Russia. They'd probably seen friends die too. They'd probably lain awake at night, wondering if they'd live to see their families again. But right now, in this moment, they were just 3 guys appreciating a well-made vehicle, and their laughter carried across the frozen field like something from another, saner world. I must have lost consciousness again, because when I opened my eyes, the light had changed. Late afternoon now, shadows growing long across the snow. The Germans were still there, though, and they'd been busy. They'd loaded supplies into the Jeep. Not much. Just a few crates and what looked like communications equipment. They were going to drive it away. Of course they were. A captured enemy vehicle in good working condition was too valuable to leave sitting in a field. They'd take it back to their lines, maybe use it themselves, maybe study it more carefully, maybe just keep it as a trophy. I'd never see it again. More importantly, I'd never use it to get back to safety. The sergeant was behind the wheel now, and the young mechanic was riding passenger. The older one was walking beside the vehicle, still examining it, still looking like a man who just had his understanding of what was possible fundamentally altered. They rolled forward slowly, testing the ground, making sure they weren't driving into a crater or a minefield. Smart. Always smart. Never underestimate your enemy's professionalism. That was one of the first lessons I learned in combat, usually taught by someone who'd ignored that rule and paid for it. As the Jeep drove away, disappearing around the ruins of the farmhouse's main structure, I realized I was crying. Not from pain, though. My leg hurt worse than anything I'd ever experienced. Not from fear, though. I was terrified of dying alone in this hole. I was crying from frustration. That Jeep represented everything about American industrial might that was supposed to win this war. Our ability to mass-produce reliable equipment, our engineering philosophy that prioritized function over form, our understanding that wars were won not just by brave men but by logistics and supply chains, and making sure those brave men had tools that worked when they needed them to work. And now the enemy had won, and they were learning all our secrets, and I couldn't do anything about it but watch and wait and slowly die. I tried to remember the last time I'd eaten. 2 days ago. 3, time was becoming elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. I had a chocolate bar in my jacket pocket. Military issue. Probably frozen solid. I fumbled for it with numb fingers. Managed to get it out, tried to bite it, and nearly broke a tooth. So I held it in my mouth, letting body heat soften it slowly, and I thought about home, about Pennsylvania and the farm, and my mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. About the smell of coffee and bacon and fresh bread. About ordinary things that seemed impossibly distant now, luxuries from another lifetime. The sound of engines brought me back to the present, not the Jeep's engine, something bigger, heavier, German trucks, at least 3 of them by the sound. They were using the Jeep as a scout vehicle, sending it ahead to check the route, and now the main convoy was following. Standard procedure, smart tactics. I pressed myself further into the corner of the basement, making myself as small as possible, and I waited. If they searched this farmhouse, if they found me, that would be it. Prisoner of war if I was lucky. Shot on sight if I wasn't. Germans were generally professional about posts, following the Geneva Convention most of the time, but things got murky in the confusion of combat. A wounded enemy soldier hiding in a basement could easily be seen as a partisan or a saboteur. The trucks rumbled past. I counted 4. Then the Jeep came back, and I could see the sergeant was smiling. Actually smiling. He pulled up near where I was hiding, close enough that I could have thrown a rock and hit the vehicle, and he called out to the men in the trucks. More animated discussion, more gestures toward different parts of the Jeep. He was showing it off, I realized, like a kid with a new bicycle, showing his friends all the cool features. Under different circumstances, it would have been funny. They stayed there for maybe 10 minutes. A lifetime when you're hiding with a loaded rifle and 4 rounds and the decision to make. Did I start shooting? Pick out as many as I could before they killed me. That's what they'd trained us to do. Never surrender while you can still fight. Make them pay for every inch. But I was so tired. So incredibly tired. And what would killing 2 or 3 Germans accomplish except get me killed faster? The strategic situation wouldn't change. The war wouldn't end any sooner. I'd just be dead, another name on a casualty list, another telegram to my mother that would destroy her world. So I didn't shoot. I just watched as they eventually drove away, the Jeep leading the convoy, its taillights disappearing into the gray December afternoon. And then I was alone again with my thoughts and my pain and the growing certainty that I wasn't going to make it out of this basement alive. Night came early in December. By 4:30 it was getting dark. By 5, I couldn't see more than shadows. The temperature dropped further, and I discovered that yes, it was possible to get even colder. I tried to stay awake. Falling asleep in this cold with these injuries was dangerous. You might not wake up, but exhaustion and fever are a powerful combination, and eventually my eyes closed despite my best intentions. I dreamed about the Jeep, not the real Jeep that the Germans had just driven away, but an idealized version, perfect and pristine, parked in front of my family's farmhouse back in Pennsylvania. I was showing it to my father, explaining all the features, how it worked, why it was so important. My father, who'd fought in the First World War and never talked about it, just nodded and ran his hand along the hood, the way he'd run his hand along a horse's flank, assessing quality through touch. In the dream, he said something, but I couldn't hear the words. I leaned closer, trying to understand, and that's when I woke up. Someone was shaking me. Rough hands, urgent voice, English with a British accent. "Mate, can you hear me? Can you hear me? We've got to get you out of here." I opened my eyes to find a British soldier leaning over me, his face illuminated by a hooded flashlight. Behind him, 2 more figures. American uniforms. I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. One of them held a canteen to my lips, and I drank greedily. Water never tasted so good. "Easy, easy," the American said. "Not too fast. You'll make yourself sick." "How long?" I managed to croak out. "How long? What, buddy? How long have I been here?" "We don't know. We just found you. Can you walk?" I looked down at my leg, and even in the dim light, I could see how bad it was. "No," I said. "I don't think so." Right then, the British soldier said, "We'll carry you. There's a field hospital about 3 miles back. Think you can hang on that long?" 3 miles might as well have been 300, but I nodded. They fashioned a stretcher from their coats and rifles. Surprisingly effective, if uncomfortable, and they started moving. Every jolt sent lightning bolts of agony up from my leg, but I bit down on a piece of leather belt they'd given me and tried not to scream. As we moved through the ruins of the farmhouse and out into the night, I looked around for any sign of the Germans or the jeep, but there was nothing. Just darkness and snow and the sound of distant artillery rumbling like thunder on the horizon. The British soldier, who introduced himself as Corporal Davies from Manchester, told me they were part of a patrol sent out to scout German positions after the American lines had stabilized. The initial shock of the German offensive had passed, and now we were pushing back, trying to figure out where the enemy was and what strength. They'd been checking abandoned buildings when they'd heard me mumbling in my fever dreams. "Lucky break. Another few hours," Davies said matter-of-factly, and I'd have been done for. We made it to the field hospital just after midnight. The doctors there took one look at my leg and immediately started prepping for surgery. There was talk of amputation, words that made my blood run cold even through the fog of morphine they'd given me. But a young surgeon from Boston, Captain Hernandez, said he thought he could save it. No promises, but he'd try. I remember him leaning over me just before they put me under, his face serious but kind. "Son," he said, "you're lucky to be alive. Let's see if we can keep you that way with all your parts attached." I woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed in Liege. My leg was still attached, wrapped in bandages and splinted, but still there. Captain Hernandez visited on his rounds and told me I'd be going home. The infection had been worse than he'd initially thought, and while he'd saved the leg, I wouldn't be returning to combat. Medical discharge, honorable. Of course I had done my part. Now I'd heal up stateside and figure out what came next. I should have been happy. I was alive. I was going home. I still had both legs. But all I could think about was that Jeep and those 3 German mechanics, and the look on their faces as they discovered what American engineering had achieved. I asked everyone who visited if they'd heard anything about captured American vehicles being used by German forces in the area. Most looked at me like I was crazy, still addled from the fever. But one intelligence officer, a captain from G2, listened carefully and made notes. He said they'd been hearing reports about a captured Jeep being used by a German mechanized unit in the area. Apparently it had become quite famous among the Wehrmacht troops. The unit that had it was reportedly showing it off to other units, using it to demonstrate American capabilities. Propaganda in reverse, the captain called it. The Germans were so impressed with the vehicle that they were inadvertently undermining their own morale by showing their soldiers how much better equipped the Americans were. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here we were, fighting this massive war with millions of men and thousands of tanks and planes and ships, and in a small way, one Jeep was having an outsized impact simply by existing. Not because it was a wonder weapon or some secret super technology, just because it was well made, reliable, and designed with an understanding of what soldiers actually needed rather than what looked impressive on a parade ground. I spent 6 weeks in that hospital, and during that time, I talked to hundreds of other wounded men. Guys from every unit, every branch, every background, and I started asking about their equipment, what worked, what didn't. What did they trust? What did they curse? The answers were remarkably consistent. The M1 Garand rifle, best infantry weapon in the world. The Sherman tank, outgunned by German armor but reliable, and we had so many of them it didn't matter. The Saracens, terrible but kept you alive. And the Jeep, everyone, and I mean everyone, had a story about how the Jeep had saved their life, or saved their unit, or accomplished something that seemed impossible. A paratrooper from the 101st Airborne told me about using a Jeep to evacuate wounded under fire during Market Garden. A tank destroyer crewman told me about a Jeep that towed his broken down M10 15 miles to safety. An engineer told me about using a Jeep's power takeoff to run a portable welding unit in the middle of nowhere. On, story after story, all variations on the same theme. The Jeep was the Swiss Army knife of military vehicles, capable of doing 100 different jobs and doing all of them well enough to matter. When I finally shipped out for home in February of '45, we sailed from Southampton on a converted cruise liner packed with wounded men heading back to the States. I spent most of the crossing on deck when weather permitted, staring at the gray Atlantic and thinking about everything I'd seen and done. I thought about Rodriguez and McCall, and I later learned that both had made it back to American lines. Rodriguez had been wounded, but survived. McCall made it all the way to Germany before a sniper got him in April. Just weeks before the war ended, good men, both of them, and McCall, never got to see peace. I thought about those 3 German mechanics. Who were they? Did they survive the war? Did they go home to families in Hamburg or Munich or Berlin? Did they remember that day they examined a captured American Jeep and realized they'd been fighting with inferior equipment all along? Did that realization make them question other things about their military, their leadership, their cause? Or were they just mechanics doing their job, trying to survive like everyone else? Not thinking too deeply about the bigger picture, because thinking too deeply in war will drive you insane. The war in Europe ended in May. I was in a VA hospital in Pennsylvania, by then, relearning how to walk. My leg had healed badly, and I'd never run again. Never play baseball, or dance at a wedding, or do any of the 100 physical things I'd taken for granted before a piece of German shrapnel had changed everything. But I could walk with a cane. That was something that was enough. Japan surrendered in August, and suddenly the war that had consumed the entire world for 6 years was over. Men came flooding home by the millions, and we all had to figure out what to do next. How do you go back to ordinary life after experiencing what we'd experienced? How do you hold down a normal job and go to church on Sunday and pretend that everything's fine when you've seen what human beings are capable of doing to each other? Some guys adapted easily, put the war behind them, built families and careers, and never looked back. Others struggled, drank too much, couldn't hold jobs, ended up broken by memories they couldn't escape. I fell somewhere in the middle. I went back to the farm initially, helped my father as much as I could with my bad leg, but my heart wasn't in it. Everything felt small and pointless after the war. What did it matter if we got the hay in on time or if the tractor needed a new carburetor? I'd watched cities burn. I'd seen tens of thousands of men trying to kill each other over pieces of ground that looked exactly like every other piece of ground. How was I supposed to care about crop rotation after that? I found work eventually at a factory that made automotive parts. Turned out that my experience with military vehicles translated well to civilian manufacturing. I was good with my hands, understood how systems worked together, could troubleshoot problems quickly. The factory owner was a veteran himself, First World War, and he gave preference to hiring men who'd served. It was good work, steady work, and it kept me busy enough that I didn't spend all day dwelling on the past. But I never forgot that Jeep or those 3 mechanics. Over the years, I read everything I could find about the Willys MB and its development. I learned that the Jeep had been designed in just 49 days, a rush job to meet an Army requirement for a light reconnaissance vehicle. I learned that 3 companies had competed for the contract, Willys, Ford, and Bantam, and that the final design incorporated the best ideas from all 3. I learned that by the end of the war, America had produced over 640,000 Jeeps, an almost incomprehensible number. We'd made enough Jeeps that we could give them away to Allied forces all over the world and still have plenty for ourselves. I learned that the Russians had been so impressed with the Jeep that they'd copied it almost exactly, creating their own version called the GAZ-67. I learned that after the war, countries around the world had bought surplus Jeeps and put them to use as farm vehicles. Postal trucks, police cars, fire engines. The Jeep had transcended its military origins to become something bigger, a symbol of practical American ingenuity that had applications far beyond warfare. And I learned decades later through military history books and veterans' memoirs that I hadn't been wrong about the impact of captured Jeeps on German forces. Wehrmacht soldiers had indeed been impressed, often grudgingly so, by American equipment in general, and the Jeep in particular. German engineering had focused on creating powerful, sophisticated machines. Tanks like the Tiger and Panther that could devastate anything they faced when they worked. But German vehicles were maintenance nightmares, requiring constant attention and specialized parts that weren't always available. When a German tank broke down, it often stayed broken. When a Jeep broke down, which wasn't often, a mechanic could usually get it running again within hours using basic tools. This difference in philosophy, I came to understand, reflected deeper differences in how America and Germany approached the war. Germany was fighting for dominance, for a twisted vision of racial superiority, for conquest. Every aspect of their military reflected that mindset, including their equipment. Impressive weapons that symbolized power and superiority. America was fighting for something else. We were fighting to preserve democracy, to stop aggression, to protect our way of life. And our equipment reflected that too. Practical tools designed to get a job done efficiently. Not the biggest or the most impressive, but reliable and effective and producible in quantities that would overwhelm any enemy. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was a philosophy made manifest. Keep it simple. Make it work. Build enough of them that you can afford to lose some and still accomplish the mission. Trust the men using the equipment to figure out creative solutions to unexpected problems. Don't over-engineer. Don't prioritize form over function. Do the job, do it well, and do it reliably. I'm an old man now. It's been more than 70 years since that December day in Belgium when I lay in a frozen basement and watched 3 German mechanics discover what American industry could accomplish. Most of the men I served with are gone. The world we fought to preserve has changed in ways we never could have imagined. The Soviet Union, our ally during the war, became our enemy for 40 years afterward, then collapsed entirely. Germany, our enemy, became one of our closest allies and trading partners. The entire landscape of international relations shifted and shifted again, and continues to shift still. But some things remain constant. The principles that made the Jeep successful: simplicity, reliability, adaptability, those principles still matter. Whether you're designing a vehicle or building a business or raising a family or fighting a war, the fundamentals don't change. Do good work, make things that last. Don't overcomplicate what should be simple. Trust the people around you to do their jobs. Be prepared to adapt when circumstances change. I've told this story 100 times over the years. To my children when they asked about the war. To my grandchildren when they studied World War II in school. 2 other veterans at reunions and memorial services. 2 historians and writers interested in documenting what the war was really like beyond the big battles and famous generals. And every time I tell it, I try to convey what I felt in that moment, watching those German mechanics circle that Jeep like it was some kind of miracle. They weren't marveling at a weapon. The Jeep had a mounting bracket for a machine gun, sure, but that wasn't what impressed them. They were marveling at engineering philosophy, at the idea that a military vehicle didn't have to be complicated to be effective, at the realization that their enemies had figured out something fundamental that their own military-industrial complex had missed, in a war full of propaganda and demonization, where both sides portrayed the other as barbaric monsters. These 3 men had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Americans might actually be better at this than we are. Did that moment of recognition change anything? Did it shorten the war by even a single day? Probably not. Wars aren't won or lost because some mechanics admire enemy equipment. Wars are won by millions of individual actions, by logistics and strategy and industrial capacity and political will, and 1,000 other factors that add up to victory or defeat. But that moment mattered to me because it was human. 3 enemy soldiers having an authentic reaction to something, acknowledging excellence even when that excellence belonged to the men trying to kill them. I've thought a lot about what war does to people, how it strips away everything superficial and reveals who we really are underneath. Some men become heroes, some become cowards. Most of us just become survivors, doing whatever it takes to make it through one more day, one more minute. But we all remain human, capable of appreciating beauty or craftsmanship or a well-designed machine even in the middle of hell. Those 3 mechanics taught me that, whether they meant to or not, they reminded me that the men trying to kill me were still men, with the same capacity for wonder and frustration and professional pride that I had. After I came home, after I'd healed enough to think about something other than pain and survival, I went to a Willys dealership. This was late 1945, and the company was starting to produce civilian versions of the Jeep. I walked in with my cane, still wearing my discharge papers like armor, and I asked to see one. The salesman, eager to move inventory to a veteran with a probable discount coming, showed me everything. The modifications they'd made for civilian use, the optional extras, the payment plans available, but I wasn't there to buy. I just needed to see one again. Needed to touch it, needed to confirm that the vehicle I'd built up in my memory was as remarkable as I remembered. It was. Maybe even more so, seeing it in a clean showroom instead of covered in mud and blood and battlefield debris. The engineering was elegant, everything had a purpose, nothing was wasted. The simplicity was beautiful in a way that sophisticated complexity never could be. I spent an hour with that salesman, asking questions, examining every detail, and he probably thought I was crazy. Just another veteran unable to leave the war behind, obsessing over a piece of military equipment. He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either. I was trying to understand something that I still can't fully articulate even now. Something about what we'd accomplished as a nation during those war years. We'd taken an entire generation of young men, farm boys and city kids and everything in between. And we'd taught them how to use tools they'd never seen before, how to maintain equipment they didn't understand, how to keep machines running under conditions that would destroy lesser vehicles. And then we'd sent them across oceans to fight a war against nations that had been preparing for conflict for years. Nations with professional armies and advanced technology in every advantage except one. We could build things that worked, and we could build them faster and in greater quantities than anyone else on Earth. The Jeep was the symbol of all that. Not the most glamorous symbol, not the one that appeared on propaganda posters or in Hollywood movies. The bombers and battleships got that honor, the weapons that looked impressive and dramatic. But ask any soldier what piece of equipment they trusted most, what vehicle they wanted to see coming over the hill when they needed rescue or resupply or evacuation, and they'd tell you, the Jeepy. Always the Jeep, because it would get there and it would get the job done and it wouldn't break down in the middle of the mission. I finally did buy a Jeep. Years later, a used civilian CJ5 that I picked up in 1963 for a few $100s. It became my project, my therapy, the thing I worked on in the garage when the memories got too loud. I restored it completely, every bolt and washer, taking my chimney, doing it right. My son helped me learning mechanics the way I'd learned from my father, passing down knowledge and skills across generations. We'd work side by side in the garage on Saturday afternoons, and sometimes I'd tell him stories about the war, carefully edited versions that left out the worst parts, the parts that would give him nightmares. He asked me once why I cared so much about an old Jeep. Why not restore something cooler, a sports car or a hot rod? I tried to explain it to him, but I don't think he understood. Not then. Maybe now, with his own grandchildren and his own memories of hardship from Vietnam. Maybe now he'd understand better. The Jeep represented survival. It represented the idea that good design and honest work could overcome enormous obstacles. It represented a moment in time when America had been tested and had risen to the challenge, producing not just weapons of war, but tools of victory. That restored CJ5 sits in my garage still, 40 years later, under a tarp, waiting for someone with the energy and interest to take it on. My hands shake too much now for detail work. My eyes aren't what they used to be, but every few weeks, weather permitting, I still walk out there and pull back that tarp and just look at it. The lines are clean and purposeful. The engine, when we test it occasionally, still starts on the first try. The seats are worn but functional. It's a machine built to last, and it has... I wonder sometimes what happened to that Jeep I watched the Germans drive away. Did it make it through the rest of the war? Was it destroyed in combat? Blown apart by American artillery in some cosmic irony? Was it abandoned when Germany collapsed and fuel ran out? Did it sit in some Wehrmacht motor pool until American troops overran the position, capturing back what had been captured from us? Or did it somehow survive everything, get shipped back to Germany as war booty, and end up rusting in some field or barn, slowly decaying back into the earth? I'd like to think it survived. I'd like to think that somewhere in Germany, maybe in a museum or a private collection, that Jeep still exists. Maybe someone restored it, brought it back to working condition, and it sits there with a placard explaining that it was captured during the Battle of the Bulge. Maybe German veterans look at it the way I look at my CJ5, with a mixture of respect and nostalgia and barely suppressed memory. Maybe those 3 mechanics I watched are long dead, but their children or grandchildren have heard the story. During the war, your grandfather examined a captured American Jeep and couldn't believe how well it was designed. Maybe that story has been passed down the way I've passed down my stories. Or maybe it's gone completely lost to time and rust in the chaos of history. Maybe it doesn't matter. The Jeep itself was never the point. Not really. What mattered was what it represented. What those 3 mechanics recognized that December day. What every soldier who ever relied on one understood instinctively. Quality matters. Design matters. Thinking about the end user, about the soldier in the field who needs equipment that works when everything else is falling apart. That matters more than impressing generals at a review parade. The sun is setting earlier these days. I'm in my 90s now, and I know I don't have many more sunsets left. My children want me to move into assisted living, somewhere with nurses and doctors on call, somewhere safe. They worry about me living alone, about falling and not being able to get up, about all the small disasters that can befall an old man. They're probably right to worry. But I'm not ready yet. Not ready to leave this house where I've lived for 60 years. Not ready to leave the garage with the Jeep I restored with my son. Not ready to leave the memories that live in every room and corner. I sit on my porch most evenings now, watching the street, watching the cars go by. Modern vehicles, computers on wheels, more sophisticated in every way than that 1944 Willys MB. Safer, more comfortable, more fuel efficient, more reliable even than the Jeep was. Progress marches on, and that's good. That's how it should be. Each generation should build on what the previous generation accomplished, making things better, solving problems their parents couldn't solve. But sometimes I wonder if we've lost something too, that understanding that less can be more. That simplicity has value. That making something a soldier can fix with basic tools in the middle of nowhere might be more important than making something that requires a computer diagnostic system and specialized training to maintain. We've gained so much with modern technology, but every gain comes with a cost. I'm old enough to have seen the full arc of that trade-off, from the purely mechanical to the fully digital, and I'm not convinced we've considered carefully enough what we've given up. The young people today, my great-grandchildren and their friends, they've grown up with smartphones and internet and instant access to all human knowledge. Remarkable things, truly. But when something breaks, they're helpless. They can't fix it themselves. They don't understand how it works. They just take it to a specialist or throw it away and buy a new one. The skills I learned, that my father learned, that stretched back generations, working with your hands, understanding mechanical systems, being able to repair and maintain your own tools, those skills are disappearing. Maybe that's inevitable. Maybe every generation loses something as it gains something else, but it still makes me sad. I think about those 3 German mechanics more now than I did for decades. As death approaches, you think more about the past, about moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but grew in meaning over the years. I've looked for them in a half-hearted way through veterans organizations and historical societies. I've posted queries on internet forums that my grandson set up for me, describing the day and the location and asking if anyone knew anything about Wehrmacht mechanics in that area during the Battle of the Bulge. Nothing ever came back. They're almost certainly dead by now anyway. They'd be as old as me, and there aren't many of us left. But I'd like to have talked to them if circumstances had been different. I'd like to have asked them what they were thinking that day. What it felt like to examine enemy equipment and realize it was better than your own. Whether that realization made them question other things, or whether they just filed it away as an interesting observation and went back to trying to survive the war. I'd like to have shared a beer with them. Old men talking about old times, comparing notes on what we'd seen and done and somehow survived. The war made us enemies, but time and age might have made us friends. United by the experience of having been young once and scared and far from home, doing what we were told to do, whether it made sense or not. There's a photograph on my wall, old and faded, that shows me standing next to a Jeep somewhere in France. Summer of 1944, before the Bulge, before I got wounded, before everything went to hell. I'm smiling in the photo, young and confident and completely unaware of what's coming. The Jeep in the photo isn't the one the Germans captured. That happened later, to a different Jeep, but they were all the same anyway, standardized, interchangeable, every one exactly like every other one. That was the point. Any soldier could drive any Jeep. Any mechanic could fix any Jeep. Parts were parts, and they fit regardless of which vehicle they came from. I look at that photograph, at that young man I used to be, and I barely recognize him. He's a stranger who happens to share my name and some of my memories. He has no idea what's waiting for him. He has no idea about the basement in Belgium, or the infection, or the 3 German mechanics, or the long decades ahead of trying to make sense of it all. He's just happy to be alive, happy to be serving his country, happy to be part of something bigger than himself. I envy him that certainty, that clarity of purpose. The war was terrible, but at least we knew why we were fighting. At least it made sense, as much as war ever makes sense. The world today is more complicated. The enemies aren't as clear. The battles aren't as defined. My great-grandchildren will face challenges I can barely comprehend, living in a world connected by technology in ways I never imagined possible. I wonder sometimes what they'll need to survive their challenges. What tools, what skills, what philosophy will serve them the way the Jeep served us. I hope they find something as reliable, as adaptable, as fundamentally well designed for its purpose as that little Willys MB was 4 hours. My nurse comes by in the mornings now. She's a nice girl, Vietnamese. Her family came over after the war there. She doesn't know much about World War II, but she listens patiently when I talk about it, which is more than some people do. She asked me once why I keep telling the same stories over and over. Don't I get tired of reliving the past? I tried to explain to her that I'm not reliving it. Not exactly. I'm trying to preserve it, to bear witness, to make sure that someone remembers not just the big events, the invasions and battles that make it into history books, but the small moments too, the human moments. The 3 enemy mechanics admiring a captured Jeep, the way Rodriguez laughed at his own terrible jokes, the specific sound a Willys MB engine made when it turned over on a cold morning. These details matter because they were real, because they happened, because they're part of the true story of what that war was like for the people who fought it. History tends to smooth everything out, to make it simple and clear and understandable. The good guys and the bad guys, the heroes and the villains, the big strategies and decisive battles. But war isn't simple or clear. It's confusion and chaos and random chance. It's watching 3 enemy soldiers appreciate good engineering while you slowly die in a basement 30 yards away. It's surviving by pure luck. Then living with survivor's guilt for 70 years, wondering why you made it when so many others didn't. It's the weight of memory and the burden of bearing witness and the responsibility to tell the truth even when the truth is complicated and uncomfortable. I'm tired now. The pain medication they've given me makes everything fuzzy around the edges, softens the memories, turns sharp recollections into watercolor impressions. Soon I'll sleep and maybe I won't wake up, and that will be that. One more veteran gone. One more connection to that war severed. One more voice silenced. My children have promised to donate my papers to a military history archive. My interviews have been recorded for oral history projects. The stories will survive in some form, even if I don't. But I worry that the meaning will be lost in translation, that future generations will read the transcripts or listen to the recordings and hear the words but miss the point. The Jeep wasn't just a vehicle. The war wasn't just a historical event. These were experiences that shaped everything about who I became, how I understood the world, what I believed mattered. You can't really convey that in documents and audio files. You had to be there. You had to live it. It had to feel the cold and the fear and the exhaustion and the tiny moments of grace that kept you human when everything around you was inhuman. Those 3 German mechanics, wherever they are now, whatever happened to them, they were part of my story. They probably never knew I was watching them. They probably never thought about that day again. Or if they did, it was just one more memory among thousands from the war. But for me, it became something more. A moment of connection across enemy lines. A reminder that we were all just men doing our jobs, trying to survive, capable of recognizing quality and craftsmanship even in the midst of trying to kill each other. That has to mean something. It has to matter somehow. The light is fading now, both outside my window and in my mind. I can feel myself letting go. Finally. After holding on for so long. Maybe I'll see Rodriguez and McCall again wherever soldiers go when the war is finally truly over for them. Maybe we'll sit around and tell stories, and I'll tell them about watching Germans admire our Jeep. And they'll laugh and shake their heads and tell me I always was too philosophical about everything. Or maybe there's nothing after this, Just silence and darkness in the end of consciousness. Either way, I'm ready. But before I go, I want to say this one more time. Clearly, for the record, for anyone who might listen or care, the Jeep mattered. Not because it was the biggest or the strongest or the most powerful weapon we had. It mattered because it was honest. It was what it appeared to be, nothing more and nothing less. A simple, reliable, well-designed tool that did its job without complaint or failure. In a war full of deception and propaganda and lies, the Jeep told the truth. And those 3 German mechanics recognized that truth when they saw it, even though recognizing it must have been painful. That's the lesson I've carried with me for 7 decades. That's what I want people to remember. Quality matters. Honesty matters. Building things that work, that last, that serve the people who depend on them, that matters more than anything else. Whether you're building a vehicle or a business or a life or a nation, the same principles apply. Keep it simple. Make it reliable. Designed for the user, not for show. And when you see excellence, acknowledge it, even if it comes from an unexpected source. I can see that Jeep now, in my mind's eye, as clearly as I saw it that December day, olive drab, paint scratched and worn from hard use, for wheels and an engine and a steering wheel and not much else. No luxury, no comfort, no pretension, just honest utility, American engineering at its practical best. And I can see those 3 mechanics' faces I never learned, names I never knew, circling it with wonder and respect and maybe a touch of envy. That image has stayed with me through everything that came after. Through the pain and the recovery and the long decades of trying to build a normal life. Through marriages and children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Through all the changes and progress and complications of living in the modern world. And now, as I finally prepare to let go, as the nurse checks my vital signs and my children gather because they know the end is near, that image remains, clear and sharp and somehow important in a way I still can't fully explain. 3 enemy soldiers admiring a captured Jeep while I watched from a basement, slowly dying, too weak to intervene or escape or do anything but observe. A moment that should have been forgotten, that seemed insignificant in the grand sweep of history, but that somehow contains everything I learned about war and humanity and the strange ways that excellence can transcend the conflicts we create. The Jeep, always the Jeep. Simple, reliable, American, built to last. Like the country that produced it. Like the ideals we fought for, even when we failed to live up to them. Like the hope that somewhere, somehow, we can still build things that matter, that work, that bring people together rather than tearing them apart. That's my story. That's what I saw. That's what I remember. 3 Wehrmacht mechanics and a captured American Jeep on a cold December day in Belgium. 1944. And me, watching from a basement, learning lessons I'd spend the rest of my life trying to understand. The light is fading now. It's timey, but the Jeep remains, in memory, if not in metal, a testament to what we accomplished and what we believed and who we were when we were tested and somehow, against all odds, found ourselves equal to the challenge.